My boyfriend kept making jokes about murdering me. Until one night I stopped laughing. I never thought I would be the kind of person who looks back on a relationship and realizes the danger was there all along, hidden in plain sight, disguised as humor. At the time, it didn't feel like danger. It felt awkward at worst, maybe a bit inappropriate, but never something I believed I needed to act on. That's the part that still unsettles me now, because looking back with everything I know, I can see how many moments I had the chance to stop it before it reached the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. We met through mutual friends, and at first he was exactly the kind of person you don't question. He was confident without being loud, calm without being distant, and had this way of making conversations feel effortless. People liked him immediately, which made it even harder to reconcile later behavior, because when someone is socially accepted by everyone around you, you start trusting the collective judgment more than your own instincts. The first time he said something strange, I didn't even process it properly. We were in my kitchen, cooking dinner together, and I remember dropping a spoon onto the floor by accident. It was such a small, normal moment that I barely thought anything of it until he looked at me with a half smile and said something like, "Careful, keep doing that and I'll have to figure out how to get rid of you quietly." He laughed immediately afterwards. It was the kind of laugh that invited you to join in, like it was supposed to be obvious humor. And I did laugh, because in that moment I genuinely didn't know how else to respond. There was a second where I remember thinking it was an odd thing to say, but I pushed it away almost instantly because everything else about the evening felt normal. We kept cooking, we kept talking, and the moment just faded. That's what made it so easy to ignore. Over the next couple of weeks, small comments like that started appearing more often, but never in a way that felt consistent enough to confront directly. It would be something said during a crime documentary on television, or a passing remark while we were walking late at night through quiet streets. He'd comment on how easy it would be for someone to disappear if no one was looking properly, or how certain places were perfect if someone wanted privacy. Then he would smile afterwards, always watching me just long enough to see my reaction before brushing it off like it meant nothing. And every time I questioned it, even slightly, he had the same response. "You're taking it too seriously. It's just dark humor." The problem wasn't that he said it once. The problem was how quickly it became a pattern that I started adapting to instead of challenging. I began telling myself that maybe I was overthinking it, maybe I just wasn't used to that type of humor, maybe I was the one making it strange by reacting to it at all. But there was always a part of me that didn't fully accept that explanation. It just wasn't loud enough to act on yet. The first real shift happened one evening when we were watching television together. A true crime documentary had come on, something about a missing woman, and I remember feeling strangely uncomfortable even before he said anything. It wasn't what was on the screen specifically, it was more the silence in the room while we both watched it, like something about the atmosphere had changed without either of us acknowledging it. At some point during the program, he leaned back slightly and said very casually, "They're probably not even looking in the right places." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" He didn't look away from the screen when he answered. "If someone actually wanted to make sure someone didn't get found, there are a lot easier ways than what people assume." There was no emotion in his voice, no excitement, no humor, just a calm statement, like he was commenting on something factual rather than hypothetical. I remember laughing nervously and asking him how he would even know something like that. He finally looked at me then, smiling slightly. "I just think about things differently, that's all." And then he laughed again, like it was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. That was the first time I remember not being able to settle properly afterwards. Even after the episode ended, and we moved on to something else, the comment stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that people say strange things all the time, that it didn't mean anything on its own. But what I didn't realize then was that I had already started keeping track without meaning to, noticing patterns, noticing tone, noticing how often he would test reactions and then retreat into humor when it didn't land the way he wanted. Still, I didn't say anything, because nothing had happened yet that I could point to as wrong without sounding like I was overreacting. Then came the moment that changed how I saw him completely, even though I didn't fully admit it to myself at the time. We were at his brother's house for a casual evening, nothing special, just dinner and conversation. His brother was someone I had met a few times before, friendly and normal, and I remember feeling slightly relieved to be around other people because it made everything feel more grounded. At one point during the evening, I went to the kitchen to help clear some plates. When I came back into the hallway, I heard them talking before they realized I was there. I don't know what the full conversation was, but I clearly heard my boyfriend say, in a tone that was almost joking but not quite, that it would be easy to make someone disappear if you really wanted to, especially if you knew them well enough. His brother laughed immediately, like it was just another weird comment. But then I stepped into the room, and for a fraction of a second, the atmosphere changed in a way I can't really explain. My boyfriend looked at me and smiled, like nothing had happened, but his eyes didn't match the smile. And that was the first time I remember thinking, very clearly, that I didn't actually know how serious he was when he said things like that. I just didn't realize yet that I was about to find out. After that night at his brother's house, something shifted in me that I couldn't fully explain at first. It wasn't fear in the dramatic sense, not yet, but more like awareness. Like I had crossed a line in my understanding of him without even realizing it, and now I couldn't go back to seeing things the same way. The drive home that evening was quiet in a way that felt heavier than usual. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that builds when something has been said, but neither person wants to address it directly. I remember watching the streetlights pass over the dashboard and thinking about what I had heard earlier in the hallway. The way he said it, the way his brother reacted, the way it was brushed off so easily like it was just part of his personality. At one point, I asked him if he was okay, trying to keep my tone casual. He glanced at me briefly and said he was fine, then added that I needed to stop overthinking everything all the time. It wasn't aggressive, but it was dismissive enough that I immediately stopped pushing the conversation. That had become a pattern, too. Whenever I got close to something uncomfortable, it was always redirected back to me. The problem was that I started noticing how often I was the issue in his explanations. Not him, me. When we got back to my apartment that night, I hesitated before getting out of the car. I don't know why exactly. Something about the way the evening had unfolded made it feel like I was stepping back into a space where I wasn't fully comfortable anymore, even though nothing physically had changed. He noticed me pausing and smiled slightly. "You're doing that thing again." I frowned. "What thing?" "That thing where you act like something's wrong when nothing is." There was no anger in his voice. That almost made it worse. It was calm, confident, like he genuinely believed what he was saying was factually correct. I remember laughing awkwardly and getting out of the car because I didn't know how else to end the moment. But inside, I didn't feel settled. Over the next week, I started paying more attention. Not because I had decided anything was wrong, but because I couldn't stop myself anymore. It was like once you notice a crack in something, your eyes keep going back to it whether you want them to or not. There were smaller things I hadn't properly registered before. The way he would sometimes watch my reaction before finishing a sentence, the way he seemed to enjoy slightly uncomfortable silences, like he was waiting to see if I would fill them or avoid them. The way he reacted to certain topics with a level of detail that didn't always feel casual. One evening, we were talking about security in general, locks, cameras, that kind of thing, and he made a comment about how most people don't realize how easy it is to get into places if you just observe long enough. I remember stopping mid-sentence and asking him what he meant by that. He just smiled and said, "Relax, I'm not talking about you." It was said like a joke, but it didn't land like one. The first time I properly challenged him was a few days later. We were sitting on my couch watching a film, and I finally told him that some of the things he said made me uncomfortable. I tried to keep it soft, not accusatory, just honest. I said I didn't like jokes about violence or death directed at me, even in passing, and I needed him to stop. For the first time, he didn't laugh. He just looked at me for a few seconds and nodded. "Okay," he said simply, and then he kissed my forehead like it was nothing. For a short time after that, things changed. The comments stopped completely. It lasted almost 2 weeks, and I remember thinking I had been right to say something, that maybe he just hadn't realized how it sounded, that it was just a misunderstanding of humor. That illusion didn't last. Because one night we were in the car again. It was late, and we had just left his friend's place. The roads were quieter than usual, and I remember the headlights reflecting off empty streets while he drove in silence. I was tired, leaning against the window, half listening to music playing quietly through the speakers. Then, without warning, he let out a small laugh. Not directed at anything I could see, not part of any conversation. Just a quiet sound, almost like a thought had amused him. I turned to him. "What's funny?" He didn't answer straight away. He kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. Then he said, "You know, you worry too much about things that don't matter." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Because it didn't feel like a response. It felt like a conclusion. I remember sitting there in silence after that, staring out at the road ahead, suddenly very aware of how far away I felt from the version of him I thought I knew. When we got back to my place that night, I didn't get out immediately. I just sat there for a moment, holding the door handle without opening it. He looked over at me. "You're overthinking again." I remember that line more clearly than anything else, not because it was new, but because it suddenly felt like it was being used to shut down something I hadn't even fully said out loud yet. That night, I didn't invite him in straight away. I stood outside my apartment for a moment after getting out of the car, trying to decide whether I actually wanted him to stay over or whether I was just avoiding the discomfort of ending the evening early. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He always noticed, and instead of asking what was wrong, he just smiled slightly and said, "You're doing it again." I asked him again what he meant, and he said, "Thinking too much." Then he leaned in, kissed me, and walked past me into my apartment like everything was normal. But it didn't feel normal anymore. Not really. That was the first night I didn't sleep properly. I lay there listening to him breathing beside me, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was just being influenced by earlier conversations, that nothing had actually changed, that I was creating distance in my own head. But there was one thought I couldn't get rid of. It wasn't what he said. It was how comfortable he was saying it, like none of it ever felt like a risk to him. And that made me start wondering what else he felt comfortable with that I hadn't seen yet. For the next couple of months, things actually seemed to improve, and looking back now, I think that's what made everything that happened afterwards so much harder to process. If the behavior had continued exactly the way it started, I probably would have ended things much sooner, but instead it slowly faded into the background until I almost convinced myself I'd imagined how uncomfortable it had made me feel in the first place. The jokes became less frequent. They didn't disappear completely, but instead of hearing them every few days, weeks would pass without anything that made me stop and question the relationship. Whenever I thought back to the conversations we'd had, he seemed genuinely embarrassed about them. He apologized more than once, told me he hadn't realized how seriously I'd taken his sense of humor, and promised he would be more careful. For a while, I believed him. Life settled into something that looked remarkably ordinary. We spent weekends together, met each other's friends more often, celebrated birthdays, went away for short trips, and slowly started falling into the routines most couples eventually develop. Looking back through photographs now, I can even see myself smiling in ways that seem completely genuine. That's probably the strangest part of all of this. It wasn't as though every single day felt dangerous. Most of the time it felt perfectly normal, and that normality made it much easier to dismiss the moments that weren't. There were still occasions where something about him felt slightly off, but they were subtle enough that I found excuses before anyone else had the chance to. He would sometimes become strangely interested in true crime documentaries, pausing them to explain how investigators had overlooked obvious details or how certain cases could have been handled differently. He knew far more about some of the investigations than I would have expected, but whenever I pointed it out, he'd laugh and tell me he just found criminal psychology fascinating. It wasn't impossible to believe. So I did. Around 6 months into our relationship, he asked if I wanted to spend an entire weekend at his apartment. Normally, we only stayed one night before one of us had work the next morning, but this time we both happened to have the weekend free. His apartment was about 40 minutes outside the city in a converted house that had been split into 3 separate flats. I'd been there before, although never for long. It was small, tidy, and surprisingly quiet considering it backed onto a stretch of woodland that seemed to go on for miles behind the property. The first evening was completely uneventful. We ordered takeaway, watched films until late, and eventually fell asleep on the couch before moving to the bedroom sometime after midnight. If someone had asked me that night whether I was happy, I probably would have said yes. The next morning, he told me he needed to drive into work for a few hours because one of his colleagues had called in sick. He apologized repeatedly for leaving me there on my own and even suggested I come with him, but I insisted it wasn't necessary. I planned to make coffee, read a book, and enjoy having a quiet morning to myself. When he left, everything felt perfectly ordinary. For nearly an hour, that's exactly what it was. I made breakfast, wandered around the apartment absent-mindedly, and eventually decided to take a shower before he came back. While looking for a clean towel, I realized the bathroom cupboard was empty except for a few toiletries, so I opened the wardrobe in the spare bedroom instead. That's where I found the first thing that made me stop. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't locked away, it was just unexpected. A large plastic storage box sat neatly on the top shelf. When I pulled it down, I expected spare bedding or winter clothes. Instead, it was filled with newspaper clippings. Dozens of them. Every single one was about missing people, unsolved disappearances, or murders. Some were years old. Others were only a few weeks old. At first, I tried to convince myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe he collected them because of his interest in criminal psychology. Maybe he planned to study criminology one day. Maybe it was connected to documentaries he watched. But then I noticed something stranger. Several articles had handwritten notes in the margins. Not emotional comments, not opinions, observations. Police searched too early. Witness timeline inconsistent. No CCTV after this point. They focused on the wrong suspect. The handwriting was his. I recognized it immediately. My stomach tightened. I put everything back exactly the way I'd found it and tried to convince myself I was invading his privacy by looking any further. I genuinely intended to leave it there. Then I noticed another notebook sitting underneath the box. A plain black notebook. No title, no label. Just there. I don't know why I picked it up. Part of me wishes I hadn't. I don't know what I expected to find when I opened the notebook. If I'm being honest, I think I was hoping it would contain nothing more than work notes or random ideas that would make me feel guilty for snooping through something that wasn't mine. I wanted a reason to laugh at myself, close it again, and spend the rest of the morning convincing myself that I had been building a story out of nothing. Instead, the first few pages only made me more confused. There were pages filled with lists. Some looked like ideas for stories or observations from documentaries he'd watched. Others contained strange hypothetical situations about how people behave under pressure, how witnesses remember events differently, and how routine is often the biggest weakness in someone's daily life. None of it was illegal. None of it was evidence that he had done anything wrong. It was just unsettling. The deeper I read, the more the tone changed. The writing became less like notes and more like personal observations. Entire pages were dedicated to analyzing people's habits, how predictable most lives actually are, and how rarely anyone notices small changes until they've been happening for weeks. One sentence in particular made me stop. People tell you exactly where they'll be if you pay attention long enough. I stared at those words for a long time before turning the page. That's when my stomach dropped. At the top of the next page was my name. Not just my first name, my full name. For a second, I genuinely couldn't process what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to explain it away before I'd even read anything underneath. Maybe he'd written down birthday ideas. Maybe he was planning something for Christmas. Maybe... Then I started reading. It wasn't a diary entry. It wasn't a love letter. It was a list. Monday. Leaves for work between 7:35 and 7:45. Usually stops for coffee if running early. Gym on Wednesdays unless working late. Visits parents every second Sunday. I felt my hands go cold. None of the information was technically secret. Anyone close to me probably knew most of it. But seeing it written down like that, reduced to observations on a page, felt completely different. It wasn't written like someone remembering details about their girlfriend. It was written like someone documenting a routine. I kept reading despite every instinct telling me to stop. The next page was worse. There were dates, conversations we'd had, comments about how I reacted when I was frightened, notes about which jokes worked and which ones I dismissed too quickly. One sentence was underlined. She notices patterns more than I expected. I shut the notebook immediately. My heart was pounding so hard I could actually hear it. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, but every explanation I came up with felt weaker than the one before it. Then I heard a car outside. For one terrifying second, I thought he'd come home. I looked through the blinds. It wasn't him, just a delivery driver. Even so, that was enough. I suddenly realized I didn't want to be inside that apartment anymore. I wasn't thinking about confronting him. I wasn't thinking about asking questions. I just wanted to leave. I put the notebook back exactly where I'd found it, making sure the box was positioned the same way it had been before. Then I packed my overnight bag as calmly as I could, even though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. A few minutes later, I was sitting in my car. Only once I'd locked the doors did I realize I still had my phone in my hand. There were 3 missed calls from him. The 4th came through almost immediately. I answered. "Hey," he said casually. "Everything okay?" I looked back towards the apartment building. "Yeah. You sound weird. I'm just heading home." There was a pause. "I thought you were staying until this evening." "I remembered I've got something I need to sort out." Another pause. Longer this time. Then he asked a question that made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you go into the spare room?" I couldn't speak. It wasn't what he asked. It was the fact that he knew. When I finally answered, my voice barely sounded like my own. "I was looking for towels." Silence. Then he laughed. Not loudly, just quietly enough to make it impossible to tell what he was thinking. "I should have put those away." I didn't ask what he meant. I simply told him I'd call him later and hung up before he could say anything else. The drive home felt twice as long as it normally did. I kept checking my mirrors, not because I actually believed he was following me, because I couldn't stop wondering if he might. That evening, I called my best friend. This time I didn't leave anything out. I told her about the notebook, the lists, my routine, the comments, everything. When I'd finished, she was silent for several seconds. Then she asked quietly, "Are you ever going to feel completely comfortable around him again?" I already knew the answer. No. The breakup happened the following day. I met him in a busy cafe during the middle of the afternoon because I didn't want to be alone with him anywhere private. He arrived smiling, as though nothing had happened. When I told him we were over, he didn't look upset. He looked disappointed. Not in the relationship, in me. He asked if this was because I'd invaded his privacy. I asked him why he had written pages about my daily routine. He smiled. "I like observing people." "You observed me. You're my girlfriend." "No," I replied quietly. "I was." For the first time since we'd met, the smile disappeared completely. He leaned forward slightly. "You've made me into someone I'm not." Maybe. Or maybe I'd finally stopped convincing myself he was someone he wasn't. I stood up, wished him well, and walked away. He never followed me. Months later, I received one final email. He apologized for making me uncomfortable. He insisted the notebook was research for a psychological thriller he wanted to write. Maybe it was. Maybe every single page had an innocent explanation. Maybe the newspaper clippings, the observations, the routines, and the jokes were all unrelated coincidences that I'd connected because fear makes people see patterns. But here's what I've realized since then. Healthy relationships don't leave you wondering whether you've just escaped something terrible. They don't make your friends ask if you're safe. They don't make you feel relieved when they're no longer part of your life. To this day, I still don't know whether I left someone dangerous or whether I left just before he had the chance to become dangerous. And somehow, I think not knowing is the part that will always stay with me.